Hello, my name is Kathleen Irwin. I'm unable to be here today with you physically, so I've decided to present virtually. The name of my paper is called À Table, Virtual Dinners, Movable Feasts. The two A's in À Table represent the @ signs in current email addresses and represent my ongoing interest in internet-based performance. My original intent, had I been physically present on this panel, was to discuss the food project, an ongoing, emergent, practice-based investigations where outcomes are offered as delicious amuse-bouche, both real and virtual. In these micro-events, stories, actions, and favors are given and taken, done and undone, made and unmade. Laying on the table the results of a week in kitchen at World Stage Design in Cardiff, Wales in September 2013, the intent of this presentation was to display to you an array of fantastical dishes cooked up by 4 women theater artists, illustrating what can be done with food, drink, music, imagination, and the mobile devices we had to hand. This was done by inhabiting the internet using only the means readily available to 21st century women. The resulting recipes are a living document of those investigations. The website is a platform for our ongoing conversations into the connections between women, food, and technology. It is a map, a document, a cookbook for future meals. This investigation into food has also driven my pedagogy for the past year through a split theory studio design course taught to undergrad and grad students in the theater department at the University of Regina. This course considered the representation of food in historical and contemporary contexts. Through articles, play texts, film, and Pinterest, we thought about, talked about, wrote about, and performed food as celebration, as revenge, abstinence, and the many other circumstances that mark our sometimes vexatious relationship with food. It was an experiment that manifested itself through discussions and interactions over food, and it was a first small step into the challenging terrain of critical and creative practice, trying to open up dialogues on the politics, conviviality, and poesis of food. None of us were experts in the kitchen, professionals in the studio, nor experts in the area of food politics. So the class, like a potluck dinner, was only as good as the dishes and conversation each person brought to the table. Having said that, each student cooked and performed food at an extremely articulate level. At the center of this creative process were a number of key questions. How do concerns about food on a local level turn our attention to global scale issues? How are food choices, taste preferences, transformed over distance and time, and how does food work to resist or inform reductive stereotypes? And finally, when we create art about food, whom do we include at the table? I would like to perform an example of the kind of work we did in the class and in the food project itself. So let's dig in. I'm going to tell you parts of 3 stories of the land of Western Canada. Of course, the stories, like the country itself, are unfinished. This is where I live and teach, in the parklands where the horizon is unbroken and the land gently rolls in all directions, to the boreal forest to the north and east, the dry and dusty badlands to the south, to the grasslands, the foothills, and the mountains to the west. Story 1. In the early 19th century, before contact, the land was peopled with tribes that roamed following the seasonal migration patterns. By some records, there were in North America as many as 90 million people living in relative harmony. This is what the prairies smelled like. First came the French and the English, voyageurs and trappers, who were in search of furs to fuel the clothing industry of European cities for men and women who sought beaver, rabbit, mink, anything really, in order to be fashionable. As these entrepreneurs pushed west, they were aided by the First Nations, without whom many Europeans would have died of hunger and cold. In this relationship, immediately, the First Nations people themselves saw the opportunity to increase their own wealth and knowledge. For furs, they traded pots and pans, steel knives, and eventually firearms and whiskey. This is what the prairies tasted like. Often it tasted much worse, as the drink was concocted of anything and everything. As it turned out, the Indians, as they were then called, were good hunters, but not good drinkers. So into this population was introduced demon alcohol and disease, flu and pneumonia, smallpox, tuberculosis, and venereal diseases. These would eventually reduce the population by 60 to 90%. This was truly the Wild West of the competitive fur trade, characterized by alcohol consumption and interrelationships that brought the cultures together in ways that would change things forever. The offspring of intermarriage, the Métis, were rich-blooded mixtures of French and Cree, Scottish and Irish. Story 2. Disturbed by the frontier mentality that defined the West by drunkenness, horse-stealing, whoring, and lawlessness, John A. Macdonald, our first Prime Minister, sent out a troop of Northwest Mounted Police, redcoats, who drove west on horseback to quell the Indian uprisings and troubles at such places as Fort Walsh and Fort Whoop-Up. And this is what the prairies sounded like. As the fur trade decimated the smaller animal, the people began to starve, and as they did, they began to eat the sacred buffalo, the once abundant animal that they had long relied on for food, clothing, and shelter, as had the Europeans. Firearms and the relatively recent addition of the horse sped up things, including the near extinction of these regal beasts. Where disease had failed to decimate the human population, widespread starvation set in. With the opening of the fur trade came the grab for land by the government of the new country, the Dominion of Canada. This period of time was known as the fencing of the West. Across the quiet of the land, the building of fences sounded like this. Story 3. The railway west through the Rocky Mountains brought European settlers who were sold and given fertile land to till. They brought their religions, their food, and rituals. You could now get a cup of the finest Ceylon tea in the shanty towns of Vancouver and Victoria. And this is what the tea tasted like. Simple foods that sustained the settlers, soda bread and flour biscuits, became a staple of the First Nations people who struggled to free themselves. Used to the nutritious diet of wild meat, the bannock, as it was called, was no delicacy, but a necessity. And this is how they made the bannock. 2 cups all-purpose flour, 1 tablespoon baking soda, 1/2 teaspoon salt, 1/2 cup milk, 1/2 cup water. And you'll soon find out how the bannock tasted. And now the final story of how the Christian missionaries civilized the Western savage. In the 1850s, the federal government instituted residential schools across Canada and legislated that young Aboriginals attend from age 6. This was not as difficult to implement as it sounds, because the reserve system was by now also in place. This represented so-called treaties between the Aboriginals and Queen Victoria, the old woman who would provide land in the form of reserves and an allotment of material goods in the form of accommodation and money. This structuring made it easy for the government to scoop up children from their parents and take them away to the schools, where it is claimed 60% died in the first few years. Their language and culture, clothing, food, religion, rituals were forbidden, as was all contact with their family. They were mentally, physically, sexually abused. By 1950, it is said, the overall populations of the people had been reduced by 90%. The next part of this story was only recently revealed in the Globe and Mail. Filed July 16, 2013 at 1:16 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Canadian government withheld food from hungry Aboriginal kids in 1940s nutritional experiments. Researcher finds. Filed by Bob Weber. Recently published historical research says hungry Aboriginal children and adults were once used as unwitting subjects in nutritional experiments by Canadian government bureaucrats. This was the hardest thing I've ever written, says Ian Mosby, who has revealed new details about one of the least known but perhaps most disturbing aspects of government policy towards Aboriginals immediately following the Second World War. Government documents eventually revealed a long-standing government-run experiment that came to span the entire country and involved at least 1,300 Aboriginals, most of them children. It began with a 1942 visit by government researchers to a number of remote reserves in northern Manitoba, including places such as the Pass and Norway House. They found people who were hungry, beggared by a combination of the collapsing fur trade and declining government support. They also found a demoralized population marked by, in the words of the researchers, shiftlessness, indolence, improvidence, and inertia. The researchers suggested those problems, so long regarded as inherent or hereditary traits in the Indian race, were in fact the results of malnutrition. Instead of recommending an increase in support, the researchers decided that isolated, dependent, hungry people would be ideal subjects for tests on the effects of different diets. This is a period of scientific uncertainty around nutrition, said Mosby. Vitamins and minerals had really only been discovered during the interwar period. In the 1940s, there were lots of questions about what are human requirements for vitamins. Malnourished Aboriginal people became viewed as possible means of testing these theories. The first experiment began in 1942 on 300 Norway House Cree. Of that group, 125 were selected to receive vitamin supplements, which were withheld from the rest of the population. At the time, researchers calculated the local people were living on less than 1,500 calories. Normally, healthy adults generally require at least 2,000 per day. The research team was well aware that these vitamin supplements only addressed a small part of the problem, Mosby writes. The experiment seems to have been driven, at least in part, by the nutritional experts' desire to test their theories on a ready-made laboratory populated with already malnourished human experimental subjects. One school deliberately held milk rations for 2 years to less than half the recommended amount to get a baseline reading for when the allowance was increased. At another, children were divided into one group that received vitamin, iron, and iodine supplements, and one that didn't. One school depressed levels of vitamin B to create another baseline before levels were boosted. A special enriched flour that couldn't legally be sold elsewhere in Canada under food adulteration laws was used on children at another school. And so that all the results could be properly measured, one school was allowed none of those supplements. Many dental services were withdrawn from participating schools during that time. Gum health was an important measuring tool for scientists, and they didn't want treatments on children's teeth distorting results. Little has been written about the nutritional experiments. Not much was learned from those hungry little bodies. The government knew from the beginning that the real problem and the cause of malnutrition was underfunding. That was established before the studies were even started, and when the studies were completed, that was still the problem. When one person wins, another one loses.